Hello, everyone. Welcome to the podcast introduction to the Thomas Jefferson. We'll make it short today. David Swenson is on break. I'm talking with my dear friend, David Nicandri. David, we talked about some parts of your book, Lewis and Clark on the Columbia, River of Promise, Lewis and Clark on the Columbia. But of course, I really urge people to go look at that book. I just reread it, and it really holds up beautifully, and it is splendidly written. And I only wrote in the margins about 20 times, "No way," or "Whopper," or "Are you kidding?" Which I love, because you take some chances, don't you? So as a historian, you're not content, and I mean no disrespect to someone like David Lavender or Stephen Ambrose, but you're not content to tell the story. That's narrative history. Yours is more of a kind of analytical history, or it might even be said revisionist, although that term is somewhat tainted. But you want to look deeper, and you are not unwilling to challenge received ideas and myths about this historical event.
Yes, I think that's right, Clay. I mean, the challenge, I've had people ask me, why don't you write about topics that there haven't been so many books already written about? Maybe your book will stand out farther.
That's your wife.
Yeah, there might be some truth to that. So you're right. I write, I think if there's an approach to what I do, it's called, and I've had a friend actually give it this description, it's historical inversion. I pick stories for which there's a perceived master narrative, and I pick it apart by suggesting that aspects of this story need to be turned on their head. And what that entails, basically, is analyzing what other people have written about a story, and without engaging in personal, what's called ad hominem attacks. I don't attack the people who might have written such and such about Lewis and Clark, or Cook, as it may be, or Mackenzie. I criticize their ideas about what they say. And it seems to me that's fair game. Discourse, that's what the Republic of Letters that we like to think we're members of the latter-day version of, that's what it should be about, matters of interpretation. And at some level, Clay, that's less a matter of choice than of necessity, because usually a topic can only be revisited if there's new evidence that's suddenly come to bear, a new stash of letters. Imagine the excitement if there were to be 6 months or 3 months or 3 weeks of Lewis's journal that suddenly came to light, or some other member of the expedition. You can write a whole book just on what light that new documentation throws on the story. So unless you have new evidence, your only recourse is new interpretation. And without engaging in fraud or outright exaggeration, I do try to test the limits. A dear friend of ours, John Geiss, once said, it's the duty of a historian to fill in the gaps of the record. And that's what I've tried to do.
All right. So a couple of quick things. So I agree with your approach, of course, and greatly admire it and encourage it. There's a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me, which talks about the way in which mythic history just gets repeated generation after generation after generation, even when we know better. And a famous example, of course, is Washington chopping down the cherry tree and telling his father, "I cannot tell a lie." We know that was invented by a man named Parson Weems long after the fact, and yet it continues to circulate, as does the story of the first Thanksgiving, or in this case, the story of Sacagawea guiding them to the Pacific, and so on. So the tenacity of received tradition, the tenacity of mythic history, is almost incapable of being exaggerated. And let me give you an example. You talked about new documents. So in the 1990s, or maybe late 80s, 55 Clark letters were discovered in an attic in Kentucky. And a friend of ours named James Holmberg published them with annotations and an introduction. And one of the letters comes a few weeks after Lewis's death, when Clark learns about Lewis's death. And he says, I fear, the weight of his mind has overcome him. It couldn't be more clear that Clark's immediate assumption was that his closest friend in the world had committed suicide. And as I like to put it, although he might have been shocked, he was not surprised, nor was Jefferson surprised. They both kind of sensed that, yeah, that could happen. Whereas we might have said that could never happen. That could never happen. Neither one of them said that. They both sort of said, yeah, unfortunate, but that does not greatly surprise me. And yet, as you know, David Nicandri, in spite of that, there are thousands of people who refuse that evidence from William Clark. I fear, oh, I fear that the weight of his mind has overcome him, and continue to cling to the hope and myth that Lewis was murdered. And so, without getting into the murder-suicide story, let's just assume that suicide is the answer here. What do you make of the tenacity of mythic history in the face of serious and rigorous revision?
Yeah, it's a challenge, and I think it just is going to. I mean, it got to be orthodoxy because of constant repetition and reiteration, and the only way to countervail that is almost narrative or other interpretive angles that try to countervail for as long. And of course, that can be overdone, I suppose. But in the case of Clark's letters, I mean, that's instructive. Not only in that case, Clay, but those letters opened an entirely more troublesome window in the Clark's relationship with York that there was no hint of otherwise in the documentary record. About it, Clark talks about giving York a thumping, and
he might sell him into the deep South. He wants to keep him separated from his wife. How dare he have a sentiment for his wife?
Yeah, really, really difficult material. So, and I guess that proves the point I was trying to make. New evidence can provide new openings for new interpretation, but it also the fact your larger point, the fact that Clark was not surprised that something like this could happen, combined with the fact that Jefferson, who was in a position to commission some kind of investigation or launch some kind of mission to try to find out, both the two people closest to Lewis, with the possible exception of our pal Mahlon Dickerson, whom we'll talk about some other time, Lewis's pal from Philadelphia, the two men closest to Lewis both believed the story, both thought the suicide explanation was eminently believable.
So we'll leave it at that. We want to go to the show here in a minute. Just a couple of things. So last question for you. Again, brief answer if you can do it. There was a time when Lewis and Clark was the center of your existence. You wrote a spectacular book, and you've written a subsequent book, and you continue to write occasionally for We Proceeded On. But then you found Mackenzie, and then you found Captain Cook, and now you found Stephenson, the North Dakota Arctic explorer. And have you lost some of your interest in Lewis and Clark? And I mean that seriously. It's not meant to be a jibe. As you move on to someone as magisterial as Captain James Cook, does the Lewis and Clark story lose a little of its magic?
No, Clay. I'll tell you why. For entirely, I won't call it pecuniary, but for business relations, business reasons. The Lewis and Clark expedition is still my principal frame of reference. I mean, if you read my book on Cook, there are repeated references to how it correlates to something or other that happened in the Lewis and Clark story. And the reason I do that as a writer, Clay, is the premise, which I think is plausible, that the aspect of travel literature that any reader of a book that I write about Captain Cook, the aspect of travel literature that person is going to be most familiar with is the Lewis and Clark story. So there's a lot, although that commerce can work both ways, there's a lot of Cook in my Lewis and Clark stuff, but I still maintain core, the Lewis and Clark saga is still my basic frame of reference because the story is so well known and it's likely to continue in anything I do in the future.
Fair enough. And more books are to come. I know that. Another cookbook and a book of your own travels. Dave Nicandri, let's go to the show. My last statement is I'm still mad at you for not putting in your cookbook a recipe. Then you could say it's my cookbook, but you wouldn't do it because you have standards. So let's go to the show. You're listening to this podcast introduction to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, aka Listening to America. David Swenson is on break. Today, I have the great pleasure of spending the hour with our dear West Coast Enlightenment correspondent, Mr. David Nicandri, formerly the executive director of the Washington State Historical Society, and now the author of several books, 2 on Lewis and Clark and 1 on Captain James Cook, called Captain Cook Rediscovered, Voyaging to the Icy Latitudes. Welcome, Dave Nicandri.
Thank you, Clay. It's always good to be with you.
All right, so in a couple of weeks, you and I will be meeting at a lodge west of Missoula in Idaho called Locksaw Lodge and having a conversation about the return of Lewis and Clark. And so, as everybody knows, that they started on May 14th, 1804 from St. Louis, and they went all the way up to the source of the Missouri, which they arrived at in mid-August 1805, crossed the Rocky Mountains, the Bitterroots, very difficult crossing, and made their way down tributaries of the Columbia until they reached the Pacific coast in November of 1805. Wintered there a few miles from the Pacific at a place they called Fort Clatsop. And then in the spring, debate is still out about when exactly the return began. I know you have thoughts about that, but for the moment, let me use the conventional term that they started back for the United States on March 23rd, 1806. Can you describe the state of the expedition on March 23rd, 1806?
Well, yes, I do disagree about when the homeward bound journey began, but I'll answer that question.
We'll come back to that. Yeah.
We'll come back to that. I would say they couldn't wait to get out of there. It had been a difficult voyage. Use that expression advisedly, that term advisedly. It had been a difficult trip. And the most difficult part had been the most recently transacted. A very miserable winter. I mean, a winter on the Northwest coast, we think of it as a temperate climate, which it is. And in fact, Lewis and Clark, their journals went a long way towards explaining the climate of the Northwest coast at these latitudes to a wider reading public. But it rained almost every day. They had very little trading goods. Hunting was okay, but not as bountiful as it had been on the plains. Wasn't as cold as the winter at Fort Mandan, nor probably as cold as the winter at Camp Wood there near St. Louis. But because of the dampness, the distance from home, the eagerness to get back, all in all, the troublesome terrain, getting there, and in anticipation of having to retraverse it going eastbound, because clearly the most difficult part of the trek going out and certainly coming back, one of them was Columbia River Passage. So there was a sense of anxiety, a wish to let's get this going. Some trepidation about what that would entail, because they had seen what the Snake and Columbia River looked like going with the flow, so to speak, westbound, outbound. And they probably did not look forward to the notion of going against that flow, which would have been enhanced by the spring freshet. So a mixture of anxiety, eagerness to get going. So and Lewis, more than anyone, was positively homesick. They were literally counting down the days to when they could get started. And one senses from reading the journals that there was a little bit of a disagreement between Clark and Lewis about when they should get going. But there it was, the last week of March, 1806, they finally leave. What I would say, Clay, just to segue to my earlier argument that I had fun with in my first book on Lewis and Clark, they resumed their homeward bound journey, I would say, the last week of March 1806, having actually started it the previous November.
Right. I know that that's one of your notions. And of course, I completely disagree with it, but we'll leave it for the moment. I'm talking to Dave Nicandri, the author of a really splendid book on Lewis and Clark, A River of Promise, Lewis and Clark on the Columbia. So, all right. So the men have been waiting for the time when they can get back across the Rocky Mountains and onto the Buffalo Plains of Montana and Dakota. They've waited because they know that they have to, that there's a choke point on the return journey. And that choke point is the Bitterroot Mountains. And we now know that the Bitterroots are covered for at least 7 months per year with snow, and that there really is only a tiny window of time from about July 10th to, well, it could be a little bit earlier, mid-June at the very earliest until mid-September. And outside of that, that parameter, that window, you take on the Bitterroots at your cost.
Yes, that's well put, Clay, because the point of time between November, when they reach the Pacific Ocean, and when they start heading upriver in March of 1806, it's kind of a unique period in the entire history of the expedition, because their predilection, all things considered, would have been to have headed back immediately. In fact, there's a lot of dialogue in the journals in mid to late November of 1805 that it's time to head back upriver, and the reasons why they stayed are discussion in themselves. But throughout the rest of the expedition, the course of the expedition, there was kind of an established timetable. I mean, they couldn't head upstream from Fort Mandan in the April of 1805 until the ice broke on the Missouri. They couldn't really head up the Missouri the previous winter until the ice broke on the lower Missouri the winter of 1804 and 5. So from November of 1805 until March of 1806, it's an open question. They could have gone east, headed upriver. They couldn't have crossed the mountains, as you say, but they could have gone back up the Columbia some distance as early as the second or third week of November 1805, and they don't ultimately do it until the fourth week of March of 1806. So I think that very dynamic itself kind of gnawed at the party. Now, they used the time productively that winter at Fort Clatsop. Lewis wrote some of his best natural history journaling. William Clark finished his map. From looking at the journals, I maintain that they were probably ready to go back upstream as early as the middle of February. Again, the days would be getting longer, the weather would be getting warmer. But for the very reason you cite, they could have rushed back upstream, but then they just would have had to have temporized among the Nez Perce for who knows how long. In fact, it's an interesting question. What did Lewis and they knew they couldn't have gotten back immediately. I think they were a little naive. That maybe they thought clearly they thought they could get through in May, because that's when they made their first attempt in May of 1806. And it would be another 6 or 7 weeks later than that. So they were trying to gauge what's the right, what will a ship show up here at the Pacific coast? How much meat can we put away before the elk go to higher ground and we can't hunt them anymore? What will be the state of the water on the Columbia River heading upstream? So there are lots of logistical details at play regarding the staging of this leg of the journey that was in a class by itself in terms of similar logistical planning regarding the other major legs.
Yeah, so let me continue this discussion with Dave Nicandri, but asking a simple question and hoping for a simple answer, which is that I think I hear you saying that it's almost like an Olympic swimming meet, that if they'd had their druthers, they would have touched base with the Pacific lingered for a few days, and then headed back if there was an open trail to Montana.
I have no doubt that that would have been the case. Yes, that would have been the immediate recourse. They touched the Pacific, flip and head east, but they had hit snow going westbound across the Bitterroots. In fact, it was somewhat of a troublesome experience for them westbound, not as much as legend has had it, but difficult enough. And so they would have quickly surmised, being the expert topographers that they were, that there would be a lot more snow with the intervening 6 months of late fall, winter, and early spring.
The men were not as healthy in March of 1806 as they had been in April of 1805. It's a wet climate. There was some boredom. There had been a fair amount of inactivity. People get colds in that sort of a chilly climate. Their food had been inadequate because it was so warm that the elk would rot before they could even finish eating them. Where that's never a problem on the Great Plains in winter. The buffalo would be frozen solid for 5 months after they killed it. And so the men are in not great physical condition, and several have venereal infections from their contact with the local native women. And psychologically, you know this from your own journeys, that the return is not as interesting as the outbound. The discovery phase of the expedition is not precisely over yet, but it's sort of more or less over. And so now it's like, oh, we have to go 4,000 miles back along the same route filled with many challenges and difficulties. So they're not starting off for their homeward journey in the best possible condition, are they?
No, those are all points very well made. And let me just amplify on a few of them. The men not being as healthy as virtually any time during the course of the expedition. They weren't as well fed. The meat was often borderline in terms of digestibility. It was hard to get because they were in a zone that not only made the venereal disease catchable. They are also in a zone that the fur traders would have deposited other viruses, colds, influenza, things like that. And a lot of the men were maybe a quarter of the men had the flu or a severe cold exacerbated by the wet, damp conditions. And in fact, one man, Bratton, I think it was, I forget his first name. He was almost completely paralyzed. Yeah, he was a basket case, we would say. He literally had to be carried for much of the return voyage for reasons that are a little opaque to me. But yeah, so
he had some terrible lower back problems of some sort. Maybe it was sciatica, maybe it was a slipped disc, but something was really wrong with him. And Lewis worried that he might actually die.
Yes, but the paramount aspect of the diminution of the capability was not physical, but as you suggest, Clay, psychological. Both just the accumulation of the rigor of conducting a transcontinental voyage, which would be taxing in itself, but knowing that one had to return that whole distance with none of the excitement, the novelty, dare I say, adventure of initially venturing west, because one of the truisms in travel literature, and I think this was the point you were building up to, is the anticlimactic nature of the return voyage.
Dave, we need to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to hear more about this. You're talking about the psychological status of the men, and of course, we're going to want to look at the psychological status of the captain, Meriwether Lewis. So we're going to take a short break. You're listening to a special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Stay with us. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm having a conversation on one of my favorite subjects with one of my favorite people, Dave Nicandri of Washington State, whose book, River of Promise, Lewis and Clark on the Columbia, is the best book we have on the period of the expedition from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific, and then from the Pacific back to the Rocky Mountains. So when we took our break, Dave, you were talking about psychological anticlimax that, that's the return journey. And by the way, they've been gone for a very long time. There's no communication network, so they don't know whether their kin are even alive. They don't know whether President Jefferson was reelected in 1804. They have no clue what has happened in the United States of America from the moment they left St. Charles, Missouri in May of 1804 until at some point when they get close back down to St. Louis, if they can get back. And so assess the mood, the psychological nexus of the men at this point.
Yes. Well, even from my own experience, the most adventuresome trip I've ever taken, and we've talked about it on a previous edition of the show, was when my son and I went to the Arctic Ocean in 2019, which being, one place to get fuel over the course of 500 miles, very difficult terrain, no cell service. Something goes wrong, you could be in serious trouble. Even my own journal, which I recorded on that trip, I noticed when I got back that on the outbound version, I was very voluble, had lots to record. But when I looked, but coming back as I saw it, and I didn't notice it in real time, I thought I was keeping up with the pace. But when I looked at the journal upon reflection, getting back home, I realized that the return journey covered about it was about half as long as the outbound trip. So, and how often when we're going somewhere do we remark that the return home does seem not to have taken as long as reaching the original destination? I first experienced that when I was 12 years old, and my parents took me to visit my sister, beloved sister, who lived in Michigan. It seemed like we could never get there going outbound in 1960, but we got back home in the blink of an eye. So this is I think a common experience in human history, but actually recently it's come to my attention. It's become a matter of scientific study because of the effect of the lockdown during COVID. Psychologists have been studying what was it like for people, what toll did that take on people having no new experiences? And there's now empirical documentation that exploring the unknown or exploring the novel has a very powerful positive effect on mood. And so traveling in the new country is a very powerful positive emotion. Think of Meriwether Lewis going up the Missouri River, that part of the trip you probably know best. I mean, you could just sense the joy and the sense of anticipation, new experience, new country, and he's literally high with the emotion. You don't get any sense of that at any point on the return journey. It's one trouble after another. It's drudgery, kind of a sense of when is this going to be over? So this has been documented by psychologists who have studied this recently, that basically exploring makes people happier. And I think this, people have to take up the cause or issue of another explorer, Captain Cook, who I've studied more recently. People often ask the question, why? He'd done everything after 2 voyages. Why a third? And I think these recent studies show that the encounter with the new, varied experience, a variation in experience, makes people happier. And that's what drew Cook out onto his 3rd and final voyage. So I think that is now there was indeed new terrain that was covered on the return voyage, but maybe 10% at most. And so I think that contributed. It wasn't unique to Lewis and Clark or the men of the expedition. Their experience was kind of a broader human experience. Rare is the return journey that matches the sense of adventure that it's associated with the outbound leg.
All right, back to Fort Clatsop. So the picture you've drawn is of a somewhat weary group that are not in top physical or psychological form. But they're good at what they do. They know what they're going to be doing. There's not a sense of dread. It's just the mission, and the mission has lost some of its sort of ecstasy. So fair enough. But one more thing before we go to Lewis, they're also bankrupt. Describe that.
Well, yeah, I think at some point in his journal that winter of 1805 or 6, I think it's Lewis who says, all that we have available to us for trade goods could fit within the fold of a handkerchief or a shirt. Now, at one point I knew this. It's worth noting that when they left St. Louis on the barge, they had tons of goods. Now they have the weight of a bird in their hand to trade with. What they have a few mirrors, some rusted out needles and hooks, and nothing of everything's been wet, everything's been rusted, everything's been damaged, and there's almost none of it left. Yeah, they had now, just so no one's misled, they had the accoutrements of camp. They had pots and kettles, axes. They certainly had their guns, but they had nothing they felt they could feel comfortable trading. Although as the expedition moves east, in fact, even those goods, a coat here, a kettle there, begins a hatchet here.
Eventually rifles themselves get traded for guide services.
Yes, the closer they get to being back to St. Louis, the more comfortable they felt divesting themselves of this equipage. But in terms of pure trade goods, literally only the coats they're wearing on their back and the buttons on them, and a few mirrors and hooks is all they have. They have a letter of credit, but that's only good if a ship captain shows up in the mouth of the Columbia, and they can make a draw on the National Treasury for that. But that's just paper worth starting a fire that winter, because no ship ever shows up.
So wait a minute, though. So they have almost nothing now. At one time, they had 14 bales of Indian trade goods, lots of pots and kettles and knives and hatchets and rings and brass hooks and scarlet cloth and trade jackets and some muskets and so on. And they're basically bankrupt. And there's this great moment on the return journey early on when I think they're with the Walla Walla. Where would that be on the river?
That would be where the Columbia River begins to turn north towards Canada, the Tri-Cities of Eastern Washington State. So
they're there, and they're trying to get horses because they're going to do a kind of a shortcut, so they don't have to do the entire Clearwater River. And Clark and they can't. They have nothing. The natives are saying, no, we're not going to trade for the stuff that you still have. And these are friendly natives. And so Clark reports that he put his hands into the pocket of one of his waistcoats, and he found a small quantity of beads. Think of this. And the joy, it's like discovering $100 bill in the pocket of one of your sports jackets or more. I mean, suddenly this tiny little remnant, they once had 40 pounds, I think, of beads. This tiny little remnant now becomes as good as an Amex card for William Clark at this point. So when you think of them going out, they had everything they could possibly want or not want, need. On the return journey, they had almost nothing with which to get guiding service, to get firewood, to buy vessels, to buy horses or dogs or whatever it is that they might need. They're going to have to find other ways to do that. We'll come back to that. But this is going to make for a difficult journey. And that's why Lewis so wanted to find a resupply ship in the mouth of the Columbia so that he could resupply with that letter of credit. And then going across the continent, however tedious it might be to retrace all those miles, at least you have money and you know what natives want. And they would have said, forget this and this and this, just give us beads. They would have just wanted the things that experience had shown were exceedingly valuable to native people. So I can't help but feel a great commiseration with Lewis and Clark as they came back from Fort Clatsop. This is a rough journey now, and and we know that it all came out well, but they have real concerns about how you cross a continent when you're bankrupt. We've set the scene here. I just want to give you 2 points by way of introducing Lewis. Number one, on the outbound journey from St. Louis to the source of the Missouri, if anything, they arguably had too much stuff. There's an immense load of material, and it's a burden getting 30 tons of material up the Missouri River on the outbound. On the return journey, clearly they had too little stuff. All they had was what they absolutely had to have: tools, ammunition, lead, guns, cooking pots, and so on. And they even wound up giving away a fair amount of that. So that's the first thing. Secondly, as to the last things they had to trade, you know this story, and it sets up your discussion of Mr. Lewis. He finally had to give away one of his prize officer's coats. So clearly they had sort of regular officer's coats and then their full-on dress officer's coats. And Lewis was a man who took great pride in this sort of decoration, this sort of official uniform. And at some
point of office,
he has to trade that precious coat for a canoe, I believe. And he throws a fit and he says, "This is the last thing we had. And I think the government owes me a new coat. And when we get back, there's going to have to be a new coat." And he throws a fit about having to give up he doesn't need that coat. I mean, there are thousands of miles from any place where you need that coat. And no one's going to expect him to come back to St. Louis at the end of September 1806 wearing a full-on captain's uniform. So this gives a little clue, not only into Lewis's character per se, but Lewis's character on the return journey. Tell us what you think is happening to Lewis.
Yeah, the incident you recount, Clay, is just a glimmer of an insight, appropriate and pertinent nonetheless. But it's just, I guess my point is part of a larger pattern where the littlest things seem to set Lewis off, and it becomes it's particularly accentuated from when they from the Cascades of the Columbia, there by Stevenson, Washington, Hood River, all the way to the Nez Perce village, arguably even east of there a bit, given Lewis's later deadly encounter with the Blackfeet once they do get across to the east side of the Continental Divide. But the littlest things seem to be setting Lewis off. Other people in the party notice that he seems to be losing his temper a little bit more often or more forcefully than he had previously. Lewis himself admits that he's more short with the men and managing the intercultural situation that he had previously. I write about this quite a bit in River of Promise because my thesis is that in Lewis's problematic interpersonal behavior on the return voyage on the Columbia, we see the first cracks in his personality that led to his ultimate and full undoing. In other words, that he was suffering a form of an emotional breakdown, which I attributed to a form of post-traumatic stress, and that there was certain aspects of his behavior. There was kind of a circular reinforcement of it that only made things worse for him. So basically, bottom line, I maintain that on the return voyage, Meriwether Lewis began to have a slow motion nervous breakdown.
Right, of course you do. And that's a wild, big thing to say. And when you published this book, I was worried that was going to be like a flashpoint of controversy, that people were going to just, the blowback was going to be enormous because it's such a thing to say that, okay, he's having some bad days and he's impatient to get home and he's short-tempered and so on. But you're saying two things. You're saying, first, he's having a slow motion nervous breakdown, a big thing for a careful historian to say. And secondly, you're saying, if you're looking for the seeds of his later suicide or his post-expeditionary breakdown, which led to a suicide, look for them here. You did not get that blowback. I mean, I'm surprised, but were you surprised that was not as controversial as you might have anticipated?
Maybe a little bit. I mean, there was so much conversation about Lewis's undoing in the aftermath of Steve Ambrose's great book that, in a way, I think the Lewis and Clark reading audience, Clay, was kind of prepared for this kind of conversation. Even your own book that came out in 2000, completely metamorphosed. You engaged in similar kind of dialogue. So I mean, I'm still comfortable with that thesis because he clearly was having a pattern. I mean, he was having temper tantrums. You gave an example. When he doesn't get what he wants, he burns all the canoes so that the Indians can't have them.
He beats up a guy who steals a steel socket.
Yeah, steals an oarlock, and so he has the guy beaten around the ears and cast out of the camp. I think it's poor Charbonneau loses a saddle off his horse, and he goes off on another tantrum. At that point, the Nez Perce Indian makes light of Lewis's fondness for cooked puppy meat, and Lewis explodes and raises his hatchet or tomahawk, threatens to kill the guy. So he's clearly on edge. Now, I think maybe the more fruitful discussion is why he might have felt that way. Now, I think it's easy to imagine what the cumulative stresses of command can do to a person. I mean, there's a lot of dialogue in Cook literature about that because Cook is reputed to have been more short-tempered on his third voyage. He'd been sick. It was his 10th or 11th year in the Pacific. The first point to be made along those lines, and it has nothing to do with the psychology or stress of command, other than the fact, Clay, that at some level of analysis, the expedition was not successful, even with the return of virtually everyone who had set out from St. Louis in the spring of 1804. In that,
hold right there. We must take a short break, Dave. I'm so sorry. Hold that thought. So you're talking about now you're bringing up a new element here, which is that from a certain point of view, especially for someone who is as burdened by his instructions and his destiny as Meriwether Lewis, the trip could be seen as having been, in some regards, a failure. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, I want you to talk further about that. We're talking with our great friend in the Republic of Letters, Mr. Dave Nicandri of Washington State. He's the author of 2 books on Lewis and Clark. The one that's most important for us at the moment is River of Promise, Lewis and Clark on the Columbia. We'll be back in just a moment. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm talking with my friend Dave Nicandri of the state of Washington, formerly the director of the Washington State Historical Society. Since then, in his retirement, the author of 3 widely respected books and more coming. Dave, so Lewis is high-strung anyway. He had some hissy fits even back in St. Louis before the expedition began. When Charbonneau lost that saddle on the return journey, Lewis says in his journal, I couldn't forbear from speaking even more sternly than I am accustomed to do, thus revealing that he's accustomed to speak sternly, to blow off anger at the men. And we've seen some instance of it in the earlier parts of the journal. So, whether he's having a slow motion nervous breakdown or not, he is tightly wound. And one of the things that he's worried about at this moment is, will we be able to punch through the Bitterroot Mountains and get back this year? He seems to think that it is absolutely essential that they get back to St. Louis in the calendar year 1806, that it would be somehow just a terrible problem if they had to winter over somewhere and go down the river in 1807.
Yes, I think Lewis says something almost tantamount to, and he writes this at Fort Clatsop: if we don't get through this year, we might not get through at all. We might be he never uses this expression, but effectively they'd be marooned on the Pacific slope of the continent. And that weighed on him heavily. I think was part of the deep background anxiety I spoke about in the first segment of the show. And so that was top of mind. But the larger context that I think loomed with over the dissolution of Lewis is mission related, because I mean they're not out there to have a great adventure and a nice story that people can talk about 200 years later and revel in what it would have been like to be out in the original or version of the Garden of Eden. There's a specific aspect of American statecraft and mercantile policy that they're looking to affect, and that is a version, what I, in my next book, refer to as the third version of the Northwest Passage, a network of rivers that will cross the continent. That specifically, when you look at Jefferson's instructions to Lewis, he's telling him, find the network of rivers that will link the Atlantic to the Pacific. Now, of course, Jefferson, as we know, or as you and I know, and I've talked about this a lot, maybe too much, Jefferson is brought to this insight by the previous publication of Alexander Mackenzie's Voyages from Montreal, published in 1801, the appearance of which in Jefferson's hands early in 1802, having been brought to his attention by his scientific friends in Philadelphia, is what actually launches what we know as the Lewis and Clark expedition into existence, because it seems, taken at face value, that Mackenzie has outlined a river and lake route from the St. Lawrence Great Lakes system all the way to the Pacific Ocean to monopolize the fur trade and encircle the Americans to prevent the American version of that trade expanding in the new territory.
But remember, Dave, that when Jefferson read Voyages from Montreal in 1802, it's the Sputnik moment that essentially it launches the Lewis-Clark expedition. But Jefferson says too high a latitude, closed in the winter, the rivers don't really cooperate. It doesn't actually amount to what Mackenzie or others are claiming for it. We're going to find a better route at a more southerly latitude and show that the rivers will cooperate. And from that point of view, Lewis has only bad news that his route is not arguably better than Mackenzie's.
And let me address that. It's nonetheless true, although Jefferson would have had no way of knowing this other than his sense of human nature, there was admittedly some gloss that Mackenzie applied to the practicability of the Northwest Passage that he outlined. Go up the Saskatchewan and other the Peace River, cross over to what he thought was the headwaters of the Columbia River, and from there to the Pacific Ocean. Although Mackenzie actually doesn't take that route, he goes cross country to what's now the central British Columbia coast. But everyone thinks he's been on the main stem of the Columbia, which is one of the points I'm building up to. So bottom line, yes, so Mackenzie puts a little gloss on it, but he seems to make a case, in fact, says so in the concluding paragraphs of Voyages from Montreal. This is the route by which the British Empire can dominate the North American fur trade and foreclose the American entry. To Jefferson, those were equivalent to fighting words. He had to get his guy out, and there would be a reason, given the very nature of the climatic differences and variation in latitude, that a more southerly route would prove to be more practical. But in fact, it's actually more difficult farther south than what Mackenzie outlined in Voyages from Montreal. And this gets to part of the problem of Meriwether Lewis, because, I mean, Jefferson, if you think about it, Clay, and we've talked about this before, he had to be one of the more difficult people to work for. I mean, if there's someone you want to be your patron or mentor, I mean, Jefferson's going to set a high standard. And Lewis, we've already concurred, is a high-strung figure. So he gets out in the field, and he has a more difficult passage from the Atlantic Basin to the Pacific Basin than Mackenzie has. And even worse, and I make a big point about this in River of Promise, some might argue too big a point, when Lewis gets to the Great Forks of the Columbia River by the modern Tri-Cities in the state of Washington, Richland, Pasco, Kennewick, that is to say, when the Snake River that they're sailing down meets the northern fork, they, I maintain, are completely shocked with the realization that the northern fork, the one Mackenzie had been on, was significantly larger than the southern fork that they had been on. And in fact, it leads William Clark to go back and adjust all of his maps. And wherever he had written Columbia River on the Clearwater, Snake River, those are all scratched out and new names are applied because of the shocking realization that not only had their traverse of the Rockies and then the Bitterroots been more difficult than might have been led to believe, the waters they were on were not even the main stem of the main concourse of mercantile trade in the Northwest. Rather, Mackenzie had been on it, or so they thought.
So let me stop you there. So just so our audience understands, what you're saying is that when they got to Lemhi Pass or got to the Continental Divide and started to look west, they were thinking that the Columbia would be there. And when they found the Locksaw, Clearwater, Snake, they assumed that they were on the main stem of the Great Columbia River. But when they reached the actual confluence of the Columbia, which comes in from British Columbia there, and the Snake, they suddenly thought, uh-oh, we've been on a tributary, not the Columbia proper. This damages our sense of geopolitics and of the route.
So the combination of a difficult traverse of the Rockies and the Bitterroot, combined with the fact that the waters that drained that traverse, what we would know today as the Clearwater Snake River system, was a tributary to the larger system. That was a deflating aspect. Those combined to very much deflate the mission upon which Jefferson launched Lewis and Clark.
From a much more practical point of view, it still is a problem, because even if you discount the affluence of the Columbia, and which is the major stream and which is the tributary, Lewis concludes after the voyage is over that there is no interlocking river channel between the Atlantic and the Pacific, that was a wonderful myth of symmetrical geography. But in fact, it's several hundred miles from navigable waters of the Columbia system to navigable waters of the Missouri system. And so there is no particular immediate Northwest Passage. You're going to have some sort of a land transfer on mules or horses or something between navigable waters of those two great rivers if you think you've got a Northwest Passage. Let
me just quibble with you a little bit about that, Clay. I mean, fundamentally, the continental architecture is what it is, and you've described it perfectly. But remember when I said that Mackenzie put a gloss on his traverse of the Rocky Mountains farther north in what is now the modern province of British Columbia. Lewis puts a lot of gloss on his description of the connection that he thinks he's worked out between the Great Falls of the Missouri and Travelers Rest.
Which he did, by the way. He did work it out.
Yeah, he did work it out. And he took the route he did on the return journey, which is our focus, for a specific mission-centric reason, because he knew the route by which he had come west all the way to the Three Forks of the Missouri by Butte, Montana, and Bozeman, and then actually south and west of there, across a wilderness, then back north into the Bitterroot Valley by Missoula. He knew intuitively that was way too roundabout route. And so he thought, if I can grow cross lots from Missoula, Montana to Great Falls, maybe I can still make a go of this. And in his letter to Jefferson, the first thing he writes upon his return to St. Louis in September of 1806, he actually makes, I would call it a lawyerly brief for how the mission he was sent on to find a river-based Northwest Passage. He does his best to make a case that he found what his great mentor, the great polymath Jefferson, had sent him out to find, which of course was all nonsense, or
Okay,
largely
now
nonsense.
just to quibble with you, Lewis does make a lawyerly brief saying, look, to the extent that there is a practicable route across the continent, I have found it. And it's the return route, not the outbound route, that took him to the source of the river. Okay, that's in the September letter that he sends to Jefferson. But then he says, what does this mean? A few articles light and non-perishable can be transferred. That's not peltries. That's not the fur trade. He's saying, unless you have a mule team on one side of the mountains and a mule team on the other side of the mountains, and cooperative natives or others who will do all this transfer, you can only take small, unperishable things across this route. And so that suggests to me that your old view, one of your much earlier views, is there will be no Northwest Passage until the Transcontinental Railroad makes it possible. All right, we're almost out of time, I'm sorry to say, but I want to quickly finish this story. So they do get through the Bitterroot Mountains, and actually only 6 days. It turns out to be a relatively easy transit, although there's anxiety and some hunger. They get into Montana, where there are infinite numbers of bison, elk, deer, etc., and the living is good. They split up, and Clark goes down to the Three Forks and then on the Yellowstone to try to determine what its status is as another possible artery into the far west. And Lewis goes up onto the Marias River, which he had named for a cousin, thinking that its headwaters might be in today's Canada. And if they were, that could drive back the border, since we had purchased the entire watershed of the Missouri River. It turns out that's not so. The river didn't cooperate, to use a kind of 18th century term. And it was then that he has a little conflict with 8 young Blackfeet Zumpegan men, and it leads to the only bloodshed of the expedition. Clearly, Lewis sort of freaked out at that, and they hastened away after this melee. The two strands, there are more than two, but the two major strands of the expedition are now moving down the two great rivers, the Missouri and the Yellowstone, to converge at the confluence of the Yellowstone and the Missouri in today's far western North Dakota. One more really important thing happens here, and that is that poor Mr. Lewis is fairly seriously wounded by one of his own men. Can you quickly tell us what happened?
Goes back to the early theme about the anticlimactic nature of the return voyage. You let your guard down, especially by the time they're back on the fat plains of the Missouri. The hunting is good. The travel is easy, relatively speaking. You're floating downstream somewhat languorously. And so people are thinking, we're just going to coast to the end of the voyage. And it's when you begin not paying close attention that mistakes happen. And on a hunting foray, simply put, Lewis ends up getting shot by one of his men in the buttocks and has to float down the rest of the Missouri River. I'm going to guess, maybe 500 or 600 miles, laying face down in one of the canoes while his rear end is exposed to light and air, so it can heal up. So it's an ignominious end to a voyage of expedition, which another figure who needs to be more prominent in the history of the Lewis and Clark expedition than he is, and again, maybe I make too much of him, Mr. McKeon from Pittsburgh, just relishes being able to roast Lewis about this episode many years later, when Lewis is trying to squash a journal that McKeon's client, Patrick Gass, wants to publish. McKeon has great fun at Lewis's expense, recounting everyone about the nature. In fact, goes so much as to say that Lewis arranged to be shot if you think my arguments are over the top, that really is.
I know Lewis as well as I think I know anything. What a way to come home, having been shot by your own man in the buttocks.
How you measure these things, I guess, is a question in itself. One of the more favored ways of measuring the expedition is that Lewis got just about everyone back that he went out with, and that's no small accomplishment.
No, we're out of time, unfortunately, but Lewis comes back. They've only lost one of their men, Charles Floyd, who died early on in the course of it. This led to a famous medical history of the expedition called Only One Man Died, no one would dare write that title today, since several Blackfeet died. And that just suggests a kind of Eurocentrism that fortunately we have graduated out of. But by any measure, coming back with only one man of his own dead is a spectacular report. When you read the history of other expeditions, say in Africa, they often lose a third or half of their men, sometimes more. This is an amazing feat, and it's a monument to the leadership of Lewis and Clark and to their choices in the kind of young men with the right stuff that they gathered for this thing. So in about a minute and a half, say something more about how to think about the return journey of Lewis and Clark.
Well, it was, it filled out the map. It enabled Lewis to make a plausible argument relative to the central mission of the venture, which was to try to establish a trade route from the waters draining to the Atlantic to the Pacific. They laid the groundwork for the American sovereignty on the upper Missouri, both outbound and coming back, and added much with the overwintering at Fort Clatsop. I mean, I think the best natural history that Lewis ever did on the voyage was that winter of 1806 at Fort Clatsop. So maybe not the drama and the novelty and the innovation of the outward voyage, but particularly by piecing together the relationship of the Yellowstone, the Marias with the Missouri, juxtaposed with the Salmon River, Snake River system. They largely accomplished the mission of filling in that part of the North American canvas.
Thank you, David Nicandri, author of Lewis and Clark Reframed, Examining Ties to Cook, Vancouver, and Mackenzie, and Captain Cook Rediscovered, Voyaging to the Icy Latitudes, and more books coming. Thank you, David Nicandri.
Thank you, Clay.
You've been listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We'll see you next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.